Okay, moving on. Genghis Khan. And okay, of all the world's conquerors, Genghis Khan is the only one you might say started out in poverty. When I was 12, I checked out a book from the library about him, and I didn't even know he existed till that time. Then when I was in graduate school, I wound up checking out the same book because we were required to do a whole lot of reading. Checked out the same book, and as a boy of 10, his father was poisoned. His father was the head of a small tribe, but when his father was poisoned, the men said, we're not going to follow a 10-year-old boy. Genghis was only 10 at the time. So all the tribe left him except for a few women. So Genghis Khan started out with just a few women followers. He grew up, made a treaty with a local tribe, somehow with himself as a head. Made a treaty with another tribe, got 2 or 3 tribes together, and those 2 or 3 tribes wound up conquering all of Mongolia, something that hadn't been done in hundreds of years. Well, while conquering Mongolia, he went into China. He died before he could complete the conquest of China, but he started the conquest of China. The problem with China, there was just too many of them and too big, but he got the Chinese on the run, got the Chinese general to commit suicide, and just terrified the Chinese. He would get his people to surround a certain area of China and slowly close in, like hunting an animal. And to hunt an animal, he'd have his men get away from a cliff, a certain distance from a cliff, and his men would line up neck and neck and start marching toward the wall of the cliff, and when the orders, don't kill anything yet. And they would march, and animals would be forced back and back and back, and then when they got right close to the edge of the cliff where the animals couldn't move, then they'd start hacking away. He treated people the same way. He'd surround them, and then close in, and a certain signal from him, he'd hack away. He enjoyed, and your book talks about he enjoyed killing. He killed sheerly for the fun of it. And he's got a real thrill. I mean, he said man's highest joy is in victory in battle. And his deeds have gone down in history. He wound up crossing, instead of finishing the job, he wound up crossing the desert, really this area here, and creating havoc with the Muslim world. Now, the Muslims fought like the Mongolians, in that the Muslims would fight on an open plain. Some of them, except Genghis Khan, told his horsemen, his infantrymen, well, I'm going to assign you to a squad of 10, and anyone who gets lost in a squad of 10 in a battle will be executed. You had to make sure you knew where your squad leader was and stay with that squad. And anyone who wanted to fight you had to fight the whole squad. He did not fight individuals. You fought the whole squad of him. And he had better organization than did the Islamic people, and he was able to wreak havoc with Islam. He went across to what is today Russia. He conquered Russia and held it for 200 years, or at least his followers conquered Russia. And his armies engaged in a fight with Poland, but he himself died, and his armies then went back to Mongolia, made the long trip, and did not finish a job in Poland. Essentially, he did not get to Europe. Now, while he was on his way, and his followers on their way from Mongolia to Europe, unknown to them, or maybe little known, they were being followed by a certain species of rat that carried the Black Death. The rat carried the flea, and the flea carried the Black Death germ. So basically, he's responsible for spreading the Black Death into Europe. And the Black Death will stay in Europe. I'm mixed up as to which rat was which, but there was a brown rat and a black rat. One of them carried the Black Death, and you might say, why didn't the other? If you know anything about parasitology, which is not taught in schools anymore, but parasites often can only exist on one host of one species and can't even exist on related species. In other words, the parasite, the flea, can exist on one type of rat and can't exist on another. Why that is, it's just the way it is. But eventually, another kind of rat came in and drove off the rat that was carrying the fleas, and the Black Death somewhat subsided in Europe. Now, that's a subject for a later chapter, but nevertheless, now, he went on, after he died, we don't hear much about his son, but then his grandson. was the great Kublai Khan, which I know I've mentioned. Why do we Westerners remember Kublai Khan? He was the emperor who, anybody know? When a European man named Marco Polo finally made the long trip from Italy all the way to China, Kublai Khan was the emperor. Kublai Khan was so impressed with Marco Polo, he made Marco Polo a high-up official in his court. Then Marco Polo came back home after 20 years and wrote a book about his travels and got Europeans interested in China, and this led to Columbus, who had read Marco Polo's book. About 150 years later, 180 years or so later, Columbus decided, hey, I can reach China by sailing west, because after all, the earth is round. He did not seem to know about these two big continents here, and did not know about the size of the earth. If it hadn't been for these continents, his crew would have perished for lack of food and water. But anyway, he was influenced strong by Marco Polo. Now, Kublai Khan went into Vietnam and conquered Vietnam. We're going to talk about this in the next chapter of Vietnam, but his victory was short-lived. His type of fighting was not very effective in the jungle, and the Vietnamese were able, even before the invention of a good gun, they would be able to practice what we call guerrilla warfare. They would hide in the reeds, tall grasses, or behind bushes of thick foliage, jungle foliage, hide, reach out and stab someone to death, and then disappear. So a Chinese army would be marching along, all of a sudden down one of them would drop dead. They march along a few feet more, and down one would drop dead. And even Genghis Khan and his grandson could not figure out how to stop this kind of warfare. Many years later, the Vietnamese would have used this same type of warfare against the United States and win. The Chinese could not hold Vietnam for long. Again, the Vietnamese knew how to fight in their own home territory. Even the Mongolians did not. Same problem, similar problem that the Islamic people had in fighting outside their own type of terrain. Again, your book mentions how that the Chinese had given gunpowder to the Mongolians, who in turn turned it against them. Now, I really don't know if Mongolia reconquered Tibet. The Song dynasty lost Tibet, but the Tibet people influenced Mongolia strongly. And if you know anything at all about Tibet, it's said to be a land of magic. And the rulers, the new dynasty was called the Yuan, Y-U-A-N. The Yuan rulers would employ Tibet people to come in and practice divination, sorcery, to supposedly help them. Kublai Khan himself was a Buddhist, but the Chinese, at least some of them temporarily, resorted back to the practice of Tibet spirituality. The Chinese were also becoming a little bit more what you call spiritually minded than they had been, less materialistic. Now, Kublai Khan did have one defeat, big defeat, other than Vietnam. He sent a fleet of ships to Japan to conquer Japan. The fleet was big enough, and it's hard to tell whether or not it would actually have conquered Japan. But they ran into a problem called a divine wind, or kamikaze. Now we're going to see that term again. Anybody know in what context?
That's for the Japanese.
Japanese suicide fighters in World War II were called kamikaze. It comes from this, it's the same word, but essentially what happened was a strong wind came up while the Japanese were on the land waiting for the enemy to arrive. The Chinese, under the leadership of the Kublai Khan remained in the palace, but the Chinese were being drowned by the wind, which broke their ships to pieces, overturned their ships and sunk it. It reminds me of what happened in 1588 when the King of Spain sent 100 ships to conquer England, and a big storm came up, and the storm was just the right size where it didn't bother the English, but it terrified the Spanish, who were in their top heavy galleons. And the English, with only 30 ships, set fire to more than 100 Spanish ships. One Spanish ship just went all the way around Scotland and Ireland and came back home, but another couple of them found their way to port. But Spain's fleet was destroyed, and they haven't recovered to now. Well, to make a long story short, Japan was never conquered until the United States defeated them in 1945. All right. Your book shows a picture of the route that Marco Polo took to get to China. He probably took the overland route. But to get home, because there was a war going on, Kublai Khan sent him by a sea route that went around the Malay Peninsula, went around India, up the Persian Gulf, and then up the Euphrates River, and then across, back to the Mediterranean Sea, and back to Italy. The whole thing took, the whole trip there and back, with the time he stayed, took more than 20 years. Again, your book talks about the Mongols. Were they as uncivilized as we say? You can read it for yourself. All right. Your book then goes on to talk about the voyages that some of the Chinese took and why they were abandoned. I mean, some people believe the Chinese sailors might have actually mapped the whole globe. All right, but then you go to religion, and I know I'm running out of time, but essentially, to make a long story short, in the field of religion, Buddhism and Taoism declined, and a new Confucianism took over, the new Confucianism that was more spiritual than the old Confucianism had been. Your book calls it Neo-Confucianism, as was the case of Europeans who got to arguing over the issue of faith and works. The Indians got to arguing over the issue of Hinduism versus Buddhism. The Chinese argued religion, and even after Confucius took over, they would argue such things as what is the best way to live, is it best to live a contemplative, meditative life, or live a life of hard work. And to make a long story short, don't worry about the Confucian philosophers for now. Your book names up Yang Wangmang and Chu Si, I believe, whatever. Two of their philosophers. Well, not, wait a minute. Let me think. Tell you what, you better look at both of those two at least. Yeah, those two. Yang, Y-A-N-G.
Is that one name?
That is, yeah, actually, that's the name of one person, Yang Wangmang. To us English-speaking people, it might sound kind of, but anyway, they argued whether or not, what relationship we had in the universe, and finally, so we're in the middle of two universes. The material universe on the one hand, the spiritual on the other, with us in the middle and having a little bit of both. That humans are a link between the material world and the spiritual. It is similar to Plato's argument. Plato would argue our essence is to be found in studying spiritual. Aristotle said, no, our essence is found in the ground of the earth below us, material things. Yang Wangmang, his main philosophy is he said that the way to understand the material world was to understand yourself. So-called school of the mind. To him, the mind and the universe were a single unit. We were part of the universe. Again, I don't want to comment on these philosophies. Each of you can read them for yourself.
Are they going to be on the test?
Yeah, well, the one about Yang Wangmang and the self, yes, that one will be. I just spent some time talking about that one. If it's not on yours, I know I made up one question about that. I did. I don't know whether you got it with the other class. I mean, that's the answer, but it is on the test.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, now, Here's something else I promise you will get, because I made 5 or 6 questions about this. I'll spend the last 3 or 4 minutes talking about it. Why? What got wrong? What went wrong with China that they never developed? Airplanes, automobiles. I mean, they finally did after they copied it from the West. But why were they not the inventors of these things? There have been several persons who have speculated for a long time. You know, why was it the Europeans and not the Chinese, when after all, if you could visit the earth around the year 1000, you'd have to conclude these Europeans were uncouth, uneducated, dirty. The Chinese, they had a brilliant civilization, and they were the, how come it was the Europeans who did, the Chinese who didn't? The number one theory going around now is the problem with China was its philosophers. In the issue of banking, some Chinese said paper money and banking leads to greed, banking leads to overextension of credit and poverty, also leads to inflation. Hey, folks, some of this is true, but it also leads to the invention of automobiles and leads to people being able to afford their own homes and with long-term credit, that is, and their own farms. I mean, hey, if the Chinese would have lived around the world when they lost their farm, all they had to do was to take out a 30-year mortgage, and after 30 years they'd re-own it again. You know, that's one reason we have made sure that several things we've done to make sure that few owners don't get land, but they had this problem. Another thing, the Chinese philosophers taught them that improving your character and morals is more important than studying the world around you and studying science. Folk, I mean, a lot of this is right. But if improving your morals and improving your character should lead to wondering, how is the atom put together? How can I put together a device that will do this, that, or the other? The Chinese simply were just not interested in this stuff as much as they could have been. Also, the Chinese felt like you advance, how high you are is how high a government position you hold. And among Europeans, well, government was just one way. You could also get high up and becoming a scientist, a doctor, a lawyer, or another profession. It wasn't all just government. So a lot of the more brilliant Chinese young men probably took a government job who might have been better off if they had studied chemistry instead, or studied physics and developed new theories of chemistry and physics, or maybe even put together an automobile, who knows. Several reasons. But again, the blame goes to a lot of the philosophers. Chinese emperors were more likely to consult philosophers than European kings. Now, folk, I'll say this and I'll have to close. I think that a lot of the problem with China, though, was the fact that they were united. Well, what's wrong with unity? Simply this. In Europe, you had about 200 different independent countries. But when you have 200 independent, supposing one of them finds the right way, they're going to bring the rest of them up, which is exactly what happened. I could say that Great Britain somewhat led the way, France following close behind, and some German states following behind, Italy leading the way. And they brought the rest of Europe up. In China, one big country under one big emperor with one language. And since the emperor never found a way, thanks to his philosophers, the whole country remained behind. Sometimes division is the best thing. It's like in our country when we had what we call business monopolies. The monopoly could put out a crummy product and with a high price, somebody had to buy it. Finally, the courts moved in and said, break up the monopoly. And today, if you decide one automobile company is putting out crummy cars, well, you just go buy another kind of car. And after a while, every company realized we better put out a good quality car or nobody's going to buy our product. Same with restaurants. If you don't like one restaurant, you go to another. And after a while, restaurants, I see a lot of restaurateurs closing down. Maybe you have too, because the customers don't like them as well as do others. So again, division, competition might have been the thing that really helped Europe more than unity. Again, some people have said it was something about Europe's religion. I won't go there right now, more than the Chinese religion. But China, folk, it was a race between a rabbit and a turtle all over again. And in the long run, the rabbit went to sleep and the turtle crawled out ahead. All right, everybody have a good weekend.